My name is Tom Kligerman. I am a partner at ICAA Kligerman Barkley. I have lived and breathed architecture since I was 2 years old. When I was that age, we moved into a salt box in New England that was built in 1665. We left before my 4th birthday, and I haven't been back since, but I could draw you a floor plan of that house. We lived all over, but wherever we lived, I loved buildings and visiting buildings. I was lucky enough to live in England and France, and whether it was the ruins of an abbey in England or the Palace of Versailles or the salt works at Chaux in France, I have loved seeing buildings and walking through them and experience them, particularly traditional buildings and classical buildings from the centuries before. When I was young, I thought I'd have to grow up to be a lawyer or a doctor, and frankly, I did not want to grow up. The idea terrified me until it occurred to me that I could be an architect. I applied to Columbia College and got in, and my architecture professor there was Robert A.M. Stern, and it was a very fortunate meeting. Stern taught us about the history of architecture. The first project we did was to measure a building and draw it. I was assigned a gigantic house in Southampton designed by McKim, Mead, and I spent 3 days in the rain measuring that building, and literally months afterwards drawing sections and plans and elevations of that building. It was an enormous amount of work, but it taught me to look at buildings and to look at them very carefully, not only the big picture, but the details. And those lessons in architectural history have stayed with me ever since. Every time we start a new building, we think about the history of that area. We think about the architectural history. We think about the societies in that area. We think about the culture. We think about the landscape. But it all comes from a place of thinking about what came before, and then trying in our own way to reinterpret that, not to simply copy things that are there, but to say something slightly new, hopefully something new, within the traditions of classical building. I think the architects who are most fascinating are the ones who did that. When you think about the work of Michelangelo, working in Renaissance Italy, an incredible sculptor and painter, but his architecture is fascinating in its detail and proportion and thought. And that's true of all the great architects, like Sir John Soane, whose work was really experimental for his time. He was always tinkering with light and interiors and layering. Or Richardson, whose work is obviously classically based. He studied the École des Beaux-Arts, but no one had seen work like that before he came along, at least at that scale and that kind of detail. Or Edwin Lutyens, a perennial favorite, who works within very strong cultural and local architectural traditions, but you can never mistake one of his buildings for someone else's. I think it behooves all of us to try in our own way to do something new within the traditions of classical architecture and traditional architecture, to even incrementally change what we've seen before. Not lose sight of history, work within it, but to maybe bend the arc of architectural history a little bit. And the United States has architects like that. Think of H.H. Richardson taking the Romanesque to an incredible new interpretation. Or the young firm of McKim, Mead in the 1880s, helping to create the shingle style, which took two forms of traditional architecture, brought them together to create something new. There's enormous inspiration for me in firms like that. I would love it if 100 years from now, architects or architectural historians were flipping through books from today and find my work and say, look at this guy who's doing. This is amazing. And we could do this now. That the work we're doing now would have some relevance 100 years from now. The same way the work of people like McKim, Mead or Richardson have relevance to us right at the moment. The history of architecture is just a fascinating thing to read about and study, whether it's the Renaissance or the Middle Ages or the Baroque or the shingle style or early modernism. It's an amazing world to know about. Whether you end up designing a building or not, there's just a world out there to study and learn from.